In this video, we're going to take a look at some of the features and options that Cluster Info offers to help you demonstrate some Kubernetes concepts in your workshops and your Kubernetes demos. So Cluster Info runs as a container inside of your cluster. This gives it easy access to information about other resources running in the same cluster. You can view those resources from the perspective of a namespace, so I'll see all the resources that are there, broken down by individual deployments, individual services, and how those services are used within your cluster: jobs, stateful sets, daemon sets, and most especially nodes. This is particularly useful when you're demonstrating node-related concepts, things like resource management and taints and tolerations. So the perspective you choose will often depend on the Kubernetes concepts you're trying to convey. So let's go ahead and take a look at how Cluster Info can help you during your workshops. So let's go ahead and create a set of pods in a deployment. In fact, we're going to go ahead and create two deployments. And as you can see, from the deployments perspective, you could see the pods being created. You can see what each deployment has in it. You can see that how a replica set, so a deployment will create a replica set will create the desired number of pods, and then you can see the individual pods, and then you can see the containers running in those pods. This is very useful when you're working with multi-container pods and are able to see the individual statuses of each of the containers. So Cluster Info, like I said, gives you the ability to do that. You can also see your workloads from the perspective of the namespace, and you can see them all together, and more importantly, you could see them how they're allocated across your various nodes, which containers are, or which pods are allocated on which nodes. So let's take a look at the details of a deployment, for example. When you apply changes to a deployment, one of the things that's sometimes difficult to convey during a workshop is, how replica sets are related to deployments and pods. So by being able to show the changes that are made, and you're able to demonstrate that a new replica set is created, new pods are created as a part of that replica set, and then the old pods are deleted. Now, in this particular case, we control how quickly or how slowly the deployment works by using settings within the deployment of things like minimum ready seconds to show that the new pods have to be ready for 10 seconds before their predecessors are deleted. So this brings me up to the panels that are used on various forms within Cluster Info. If you look at this info panel, or this info button, allows you to toggle various information panels on and off. So these are live panels and will update during your deployments, so you can actually see how many replicas are currently available. So you can get additional information about various resources. The button next to it is a little price tag or a label type button that indicates the labels that are associated with the resource that you're looking at. So in this case, we're looking at the labels associated with this replica set, and you can see that it still has the yellow label, as opposed to this replica set that has the lime label from before. So as far as this color label, Cluster Info allows you to add an optional color label and set it to whatever HTML color you prefer. And this helps a lot when you're looking at quite a few different pods, especially in the context of a node, and you're able to see different deployments simply by without looking at their names, simply by looking at their color. Okay, so color is a nice feature. It's an option. You don't have to set it, but if you do, it'll use it. So next to the label, there is the events dialog. So the events dialog will actually show the events that happen within each resource that you click on. So in this case, you could see that those pods were created and then subsequently deleted for this replica set. In addition, you could also see the events that were created at the deployment level, and if you click on the status of the pod, it'll show you the events that were associated with that pod. This is obviously equivalent to doing a kube control describe command and looking at a specific events. Now you could also click on the details of a specific pod and be able to see its details. You can actually see all the details of a pod, including its selectors, its affinity, its different containers. If there are more containers here, you'll see more tabs with individual logs based on the containers themselves. And then again, you can see the events of the pod. The third button is the YAML of whatever resource that you're looking at. So in this case, we're looking at the YAML of the pod. If we were to do this on deployment, we could see the YAML of deployment and so forth. As you can see, there are a lot of internal columns in here, and these were all generated from the cluster itself. So this is the equivalent of doing an output YAML command to generate this result. Okay, so that's available on most resources. If I were to look at the YAML, for example, for a replica set, I can see things that are specific to that replica set, like its revision is specified as an actual annotation instead of a property, as just an example. Okay, so again, this gives you the ability to look at the details of a particular resource. So now let's take a look at some of the options you have available within cluster info, and these apply to every perspective, every page, and are global to the system. So in this case, we're showing the containers within the pod. You can actually turn that off. If you go to this gear icon here, you can see here are the options that are available to you when you're doing the presentation. So one of the things you can do is turn off the pod containers, which allows you to have a more concise view of the pods without actually listing the containers. This becomes again a real issue when you're showing multi-container pods. Showing every container in every pod could use up a significant amount of real estate. In addition to turning off the pod containers, you could also, depending on the demos that you're doing, actually show the resources within the pod. So if we were to look at the resources of certain pods, you can actually see, in this case, you can see the requests, the limits, and the current resources that are updated every 15 or 20 seconds from the metric server running in your cluster. This is particularly useful when you're doing demos that talk about scaling and other features that are related to resource management. To be able to see a live view of the resources is quite useful. So we already looked at the info panel here. We can expand that at any time, but if we navigate away from that, it collapses that panel. So there are times when you actually want to see that panel at all times. You can do that by simply turning info panels on, and it'll show you these panels all the time. In addition, especially when you're using info panels, sometimes all those rarely used columns or rarely used fields are sometimes hard to determine what they are actually for. You can turn on tooltips, and the tooltips will work especially with the different info panels, and you can actually get a sense of what those various fields represent. As you can see, that's sometimes an annoying feature when there's too many things that are referenced. So you certainly have the option to turn that feature off. All right. So let's take a look at the pod itself. As you can see, the definition of a pod shows its name, its current state here in terms of whether it's running or whether it's invalid or pending or what have you. And again, clicking on that will show you the event history of that pod. You can see the IP address and then again the color that we had talked about. But and that's really useful when you're looking at individual pods. But a lot of times what you may want to do is you may want to have quite a few pods on the screen together, and this view could be a little bit too much information. So one of the things that one of the options that cluster info gives you is the ability to display mini pods. And when you display mini pods, there are much smaller versions of those pods. The IP address is in there. The name is abbreviated, so so it takes a lot less space, but you're able to see a bigger picture of what's going on. This is especially useful when you're dealing with 20, 30, 50 pods on the screen at the same time. It becomes too much information if you have the full view. And especially with those large number of pods, you may want to have an even smaller view. And so cluster info gives you the ability to display micropods. And micropods is really where the colors come in. And the colors are really essential for displaying micropods, because now you can see different resources, different deployments, and this is especially useful when you're doing demos of things like taints and tolerations that we'll do a little bit later on, that will show you which workloads are being allocated on which nodes. So this is again a global view. If I were to go to any of the other forms and look at that view, those settings will still be in effect. Okay, so as part of deployments, you'll see, or as part of any of the demo scripts that come with cluster info, you'll occasionally see a message down here that describes, what command is being executed, or some changes that are being made, or things like that. In this case, I applied a change to the YAML, and I show the change that was made. Those messages will stay up there for 10 seconds. You can choose to make them stay there longer, or not show them at all. But either way, they disappear after 10 seconds. So if you ever want to reference them in any way, there's a little message history button here that actually show you all the messages that were shown during your session up to the last 50, and you can change that in the configuration as well, and thus allows you to reference those. As you can see, you can send info boxes, commands, or YAML changes. Any of those will display, and then the history will continue to display. Once you're finished with the demo, it's a good idea to reset it, so that way you're only looking at the messages associated with each demo. Whether or not you show messages, they'll be recorded in the history, so you can have demos where you turn off the message display, not show the messages as they come in, but still have them as reference in the history.